On the 29th of April, 1945, soldiers of the United States Army's 45th Infantry Division entered Dachau concentration camp in southern Bavaria and encountered something that none of them had been adequately prepared for by any briefing or any prior experience or any framework that their training had given them for processing what combat in Europe produced. What they found at Dachau was the product of 12 years of continuous operation of a facility that had been the first concentration camp established by the Nazi regime, and that had served in the years since its establishment as the model and the template for everything the regime had built afterward. It had been operating since 1933. It had processed tens of thousands of human beings through its system. And on the morning of April the 29th, 1945, when the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division came through its gates, it contained approximately 32,000 survivors in conditions that the soldiers who encountered them spent the rest of their lives struggling to describe with the accuracy those conditions deserved. It also contained, near the entrance to the camp, a train. The train was a collection of railway cars that had arrived at Dachau in the days before the liberation carrying prisoners from other camps in the system that the advancing Allied forces were closing, and the people who had been loaded onto those cars had not survived the journey. The cars contained approximately 2,000 bodies. The soldiers who encountered the train encountered it before they entered the camp itself, and what they saw in those cars was the thing that several of them identified afterward as the specific image that their minds could not subsequently release. The image that returned to them in the particular way that the worst things seen in war return, without warning and with complete fidelity to every detail of the original encounter. The SS guards at Dachau had not all fled before the American advance. Some of them were present when the 45th Infantry Division arrived. Some of them attempted to surrender in the formal military manner, presenting themselves to American soldiers with their hands raised in the gesture that the laws of war designated as the signal of non-combatant status and the claim to the protections that non-combatant status provided. What happened next has been documented and investigated and debated and analyzed in the decades since April 29th, 1945, and the documentation and the investigation and the debate and the analysis have not produced a simple account because the events themselves were not simple, and the situation that produced them was not simple, and the human beings involved in them were not simple in the way that a simple account would require them to be. A number of SS guards were killed by American soldiers after they had indicated surrender. The number has been documented variously, and the specific circumstances of specific incidents have been reconstructed with varying degrees of completeness and certainty, but the essential fact is not in dispute. American soldiers who had just walked past the train and through the gate and into the camp and encountered what 32,000 survivors looked like after varying periods in the Dachau system, American soldiers operating in that specific psychological state encountered SS guards who were attempting to surrender and killed some of them. The report of what had happened reached the relevant commanders within hours, and within days the question of what was to be done about it reached Patton. Patton received the formal request that he initiate court-martial proceedings against the soldiers involved. The request came through the command channels with the weight of the institutional and legal framework that the American military had developed for maintaining the discipline and the conduct standards that distinguished a professional army from the things it was fighting against, and the request was framed in the language of that framework, invoking the laws of war and the obligations of American soldiers under those laws, and the necessity of demonstrating through formal accountability that the United States Army held its soldiers to standards that applied regardless of the circumstances in which they found themselves. Patton read the request. He read it with the attention he gave to all formal communications that required a response that was going to become part of the official record, the careful attention of a man who understood that what he said in response to this specific request was going to be heard and weighed and remembered by people who were not present in the room where he said it. Then he put it down. He called in the officer who had brought him the request, and he looked at him for a moment, and he said that he wanted to make sure he understood the request correctly. He said that he was being asked to bring formal charges against American soldiers who had just liberated a concentration camp, who had just walked past 2,000 bodies in railway cars and through the gates of a facility that had been killing and destroying human beings systematically for 12 years, and who had then encountered the men responsible for operating that facility attempting to surrender, and who had made the decision they had made in that specific moment, in that specific state, after seeing those specific things. He said that he wanted to confirm that this was the correct understanding of what was being requested of him. The officer confirmed that it was. Patton was quiet for a moment. His aide, who was present, said that the quiet lasted longer than Patton's silences normally lasted, and that what was happening in it was visible in the way Patton was sitting, the specific physical quality of a man conducting an internal process that required the silence and was going to produce something at the end of it that the silence had been necessary for. Then Patton said what he said. He said that he was not going to do it. He said this without elaboration initially, stating it as a fact in the same register that he would state any operational fact, with the flatness and the finality of something that had been decided and was not available for further discussion. Then he elaborated. He said that he had spent the previous weeks driving through Germany and walking through the facilities that his army was liberating and looking at what those facilities contained and talking to the people who had survived them, and that what he had seen and heard had given him a complete and specific understanding of what the SS had been and what it had done, and what the men who had operated facilities like Dachau had spent the preceding years of their lives doing. He said that the laws of war were laws he believed in and had followed and required his soldiers to follow because the laws of war existed for reasons that were fundamental to what distinguished a professional army from the things a professional army fought against, and that he was not dismissing those laws or suggesting they did not apply. He said that what he was saying was different from that. He said that what he was saying was that the specific soldiers involved in the specific events at Dachau on April 29th had just done something that no human being who had not done it could fully understand, which was walk through that gate and see what was inside it and continue to function as soldiers, and that the demand that those soldiers be court-martialed for the decisions they had made in the immediate psychological aftermath of that encounter was a demand that required him to weigh the laws of war against something that the laws of war had not been written to address, because the thing that produced the events at Dachau on April 29th was not a thing that the laws of war had been written with in mind. He said that the SS guards who had been killed at Dachau had spent years operating a facility that processed and destroyed human beings as a matter of institutional policy and daily operational routine. He said that the gesture of raising one's hands that the laws of war designated as the claim to protected status was a gesture that carried a weight of moral assumption behind it, the assumption that the person making the gesture was a combatant in a conventional military conflict who had fought within the boundaries that the laws of war established, and who was now claiming the protection those laws provided. He said that what the SS personnel at Dachau had been doing for the years preceding April 29th was not fighting within the boundaries that the laws of war established, and that the gesture of surrender they were making was a gesture whose moral weight he found it very difficult to assess in the same terms that the laws of war assumed. He said that he was not going to court martial soldiers who had survived seeing what those soldiers had survived seeing, and then made the decision those soldiers had made. He said that if the people requesting the court-martial wanted to send someone to relieve him of command for that decision, they were welcome to try, and that he would be at 3rd Army headquarters when they arrived. There was no court-martial. The investigation that had been initiated was concluded without formal charges being brought, and the specific legal and institutional reasoning behind that conclusion has been documented and analyzed in the decades since, with the complexity that the situation deserved. But the people who were present in the room when Patton said what he said, and the people to whom what he said was reported, understood that his response had been a significant element in how the situation resolved. His aide wrote that evening that what he had witnessed in Patton's response to the court-martial request was something he had been trying to find the right description for since the meeting ended, and that the description he kept returning to was that it was the response of a man who had looked at the full weight of what his soldiers had encountered and what they had done, and had then looked at the full weight of what was being asked of him in response to what they had done, and had made the only decision that he could make while remaining the specific person he was. He wrote that Patton had not been dismissing the laws of war. He wrote that Patton understood the laws of war as well as anyone he had served with and believed in them as a professional and a soldier. He wrote that what Patton had done was something different from dismissing the laws of war. He wrote that Patton had looked at a situation that the laws of war had not been written to address, and had made a human judgment about what the situation required that went beyond what the laws of war could tell him, and that the judgment he had made was one that his aide believed, having been present for everything that the 3rd Army had seen in the preceding weeks, was the right one. He wrote that he did not think this was a simple thing to say, and that he was not saying it simply. He wrote that he was saying it because he had been there and had seen what his soldiers had seen, and had watched Patton walk through the same things his soldiers had walked through, and had heard Patton say what he said in the room that afternoon, and that what he had witnessed across all of those things was a man attempting to do justice to a situation that justice, in its conventional forms, was not fully equipped to address. He wrote that he thought Patton had succeeded. He wrote that he thought success in that specific situation, doing justice to something that justice was not fully equipped to address, was among the hardest things a commander could be asked to do, and that it was among the things he was most grateful to have witnessed Patton attempt and achieve. The soldiers who had been at Dachau on April 29th were not court-martialed. They went home after the war ended. They went home to the ordinary lives that surviving the war made available to them, lives that contained the specific permanent weight of everything they had seen and done in Europe, and that they carried that weight through in the ways that the men of their generation carried such weight, which is to say, largely in silence and largely alone, and with the particular endurance of people who had decided that the weight was theirs to carry, and that carrying it was what the situation required of them. Some of them spoke about Dachau before they died. Some of them spoke about April 29th specifically, and what they said about it, the men who had been there, was not simple and did not resolve into a simple account, because the thing they had been part of was not simple and did not resolve. What they said was that they had been there, that they had seen what they had seen, that they had done what they had done, and that they had never forgotten any of it. Not the train, not the gate, not what was inside the gate, and not the fact that when someone had tried to make them answer for what they had done in that specific moment after seeing those specific things, there had been a general who had looked at the full weight of everything and had said no. They remembered that too. They remembered it with the specific gratitude of men who understood that what Patton had done in that room was not excuse them or absolve them or tell them that what had happened at Dachau on April 29th was something that required no further accounting from anyone. They understood that Patton had done something harder than that and more honest than that. He had looked at what they had done and at what had produced it and had refused to reduce either one to something simpler than it was. That was what they remembered. That was what they carried.